Over the centuries, the Bretons have been described by their neighbours as fractious, martial and quarrelsome. All of these traits imply a race of petty squabblers, no good to anyone, themselves included. But it is these very characteristics that shape the Bretons into a people uniquely moulded to living in prosperity and relative contentment. There is hope for all classes and creeds in Breton-ruled High Rock. For adventurous, enterprising types, the lands of Tamriel's northwest are ripe for the taking, and as the old Breton proverb goes, find a new hill, become a king. And if you lack the resources or support to forge your own kingdom, then there is no shortage of dangerous deeds, lurking over the crest of every hill, awaiting a humble farm boy with a hunger for heroism. The reaches and ranges of High Rock are rich in the commodities of honour and renown, ready to be mined by the legendary knights of tomorrow. The Bretons have found happiness in diligence, and ambition is rewarded for those willing to draw their swords and raise their shields at all tribulations, no matter how daunting. So where some would say Bretons are aggressive and quarrelsome, others would say fervent and resolute. It is a matter of perspective. There is undoubtedly a bluntness to their austerity. They live simply, passing up pretentious ostentation for practicality. And to understand why the Bretons choose this way of life, you must understand their race's history, their racial experience, from centuries of subjugation beneath a foreign dynasty to the polar opposite. A tumultuous period lacking any established leadership, followed by a gradual and thoroughly deserved rise to prosperity. And all the while, every Breton had grown closely acquainted to warfare and violence, so much so that you can see it etched into their culture and architecture. There is a great deal of nuance to the Bretons, even if they are often overlooked as the mongrel dregs of bygone times, the hybrid offspring of primitive humans and a forgotten elven dynasty. And we're going to tackle all of this nuance today, as we delve into the complete guide to the Bretons of High Rock. My name is Drew, this is FudgeMuppet, and let's get right into it. Unlike most of the other races of Manmer and Beast, who all have their own unique creation stories, the origins of the Bretons can be traced back to a specific point in time, to the exodus of the Durrani clan of elves from Somerset to the mainland of Tamriel. The Durrani were Altmer through and through, so how does their journey to the Iliac Bay and High Rock explain the birth of the Bretons, who are quite clearly not High Elves? Well, it has long been common knowledge that men and elves can interbreed, but when looking at the demographics of Tamriel, especially in the early eras, you'd have good cause to doubt their abilities to mix their genes. This is partially due to the fact that mixed race offspring will, for the most part, inherit the traits of the mother. You could call this fact very convenient from a game development standpoint, but the notion is attested to by the reputable Council of Healers of the Imperial University. In the text, Notes on Racial Phylogeny, they claim, after much analysis of living specimens, the Council long ago determined that all races of elves and humans may mate with each other and bear fertile offspring. Generally, the offspring bear the racial traits of the mother, though some traces of the father's race may also be present. The other reason you'd have to doubt the ability of the various Tamrielic races to interbreed is the reality that the provinces of the continent are not particularly diverse. This can largely be chalked up to the known races placing a high value on cultural conservation and border security. Interactions between the races tend to be in the form of war, not peace and love. Try catching a ferry to Morrowind as a Nord or Redguard for most of recorded history. You'd be heckled with insults, old and new, like Outlander and Enwar. Efforts have been made to embrace diversity in some provinces under some rulers. The Empire is ahead of the curve in this respect, because they are considered exceedingly cosmopolitan relative to the rest of Tamriel, and because they are at the heart of the continent and are constantly making trade deals with their neighbours, even colonising them. Whatever the case, I digress. The point I'm trying to make is, despite appearances suggesting the contrary, it is absolutely possible for men and mer to have children across racial lines, and this is how the Bretons came to be. During the Malefic and First Eras, much of Tamriel's north was populated by Nedic humans. It is speculated that they initially migrated south from the distant icy continent of Atmora, but when they stumbled across the region we now know as High Rock, it was pretty much theirs for the taking. At around the same time, a prominent clan of aristocrats from Somerset were setting their sights on the unclaimed mainland. They headed to the Iliac Bay and stumbled upon a monolithic relic of the Dawn Times, the Adamantine Tower, erected by the gods, and they knew knew that this would be the seat of their expanded dynasty. When they encountered the Needs, they had no inclinations that the land was to be shared. The elves were undoubtedly responsible for bringing civilization to the mainland's northwest. The Needs, whenever they arrived, were nothing more than nomadic tribals, so they conquered the humans and placed them at the bottom of their social hierarchies. Compared to the treatment of Needs by other elven migrations, like the Aelids of Sirad, the humans of High Rock were rather fortunate. The Dureni elves did not enslave the Needs, nor submit them to torture or torment in the name of entertainment or art. They simply subjugated them, which, relatively speaking, was a kindness. The Needs were ruled over by the elves, and were to treat their overlords as nobility. As is the case in feudal societies, the noble caste held vassalage over the lower class of peasantry. So the Dureni elves, for all intents and purposes, owned the Needs, and this gave them certain rights and privileges. One of these privileges was known as the Perquisite of Coercion, and as the name suggests, allowed them to freely engage in casual sex with any human they desired. The Dureni sought out the most attractive young Needic subjects for recreational sex, and many nobles even competed to have the most alluring collection of humans in their courts and palaces. This practice was intended for indulgence only, but inevitably Manmer offspring was commonplace. In typical Altmer fashion, the children born of these human concubines were not considered equals to elves, regardless of the rank and title of the noble parent. But just because they were sub-mer does not mean they were exiled from the gentry or treated particularly poorly. They were given respectable positions in society, positions that pure Needs could only dream of. As more and more half-breeds or Manmer were born, a new class formed, one that slotted between the lower class humans and upper class elves. Of course, purity is purity, and half-elves were still not eligible to marry true Dureni high elves. As a result, the Breton physical appearance leaned more towards Need than elf, as half-elves would, generally speaking, only marry and reproduce with other half-elves or humans. The name Breton derives from the Elnefex language, in which Beratu means half. Bretons generally look like the other pale races of human, only with more slender builds, sharper features, and slightly pointed ears. Depending on their genetics, a Breton can look entirely human, or quite similar to high elves, though of course the latter is very rare. Having elven blood offers the benefits of an affinity for all things arcane. They are proficient spellcasters, and have innate magicka resistance. As the ambitious Dureni dynasty annexed greater swaths of new territory, Bretons became more involved in positions of power. The Dureni were never numerous, as high elves generally have very few children, so the Manmeri were essentially being groomed into leadership by the Dureni. Even when the elven dynasty was at its most dominant, in the early centuries of the First Era, Dureni influence spread across High Rock, as well as parts of modern-day Hammerfell and Skyrim. But there was a looming threat to the southeast. The Aelid Empire had fallen to the Elysian human rebels, and the once mighty Heartland elves were flocking to Dureni land as refugees. The pivotal year in these early days was First Era 482, the Battle of Glenumbra Moors. The Elysians advanced west with conquest and the elimination of elves on their minds. The Clovian kings, predominantly King Rislav Larich of Skingrad, had been aptly dealing with the Elysian threat for some years before the ultimate battle, but the Elysians kept pushing. Aidan Dureni's forces defeated the Imperials in several battles too. Alas, the advance was still undeterred. Then the bulk of both forces, Dureni and Elysian, met in Glenumbra, and the war was finally decided. With the military prowess of Aidan Dureni, the sorceries of the legendary enchantress Raven Dureni, and some unlikely allies, namely the Aelid king Leloriaran Dinar of Nenalata, and High King Hogue Merkiller of Skyrim, the Elysians were outmatched, and the Dureni emerged victorious. But this triumph was bittersweet. The Dureni were assuredly the winners, but they suffered great losses. The High Elves of the Dureni clan were powerful, but they were few in number to begin with. Their numbers would never recoup, and eventually, the huge amount of territory they had conquered proved too large for them. The Bretons they had sired over the generations inherited much of this land. Some say the Bretons used force to push their elven overlords out, but it seems more likely that the change of the guard was a natural process. The Bretons were numerous, the Dureni were not. Within 20 years of the Battle of Glenumbra Moors, the Dureni were isolated to the Isle of Balfiera in the heart of the Iliac Bay. Some Altmer kings held out here and there, but they were no longer the focal point of High Rock politics, and so began the independent history of Breton-ruled High Rock, a time spearheaded by an attitude of disdain toward their former rulers. In order to establish themselves as the new ruling class, the Breton nobles, many of whom could trace their lineage back to the Dureni, denounced the elves, and so the path path was paved for a new civilization in High Rock, one that looks nothing like an elven colony. If we look at High Rock today, it's clear to see how effective this was. High Rock, from culture to architecture, is entirely unlike Somerset, where the Ultima favour ornate towers and palaces carved meticulously from glass. The Bretons choose functional, homely structures of stone and wood. The Pocket Guide to the Empire First Edition comments on this style choice. Their villages are pleasant collections of half-timbered structures of 1 or 2 stories, with the rustic inn, a shop or two, and perhaps a lordly manor completing the picture. The traveller need not visit more than a handful of Breton communities before satisfying himself that he has captured the flavour of the whole. The people too, despite their cherished particularism, are remarkably similar in name, accent and dress throughout the province. You also won't find much of interest in their religious beliefs, as for the most part, the Bretons acknowledge the divines, with a few elven deities enduring from the Durrani dynasty, including Magnus, Fianaster and Ifra. They also refer to Lorcan as Sheor, the demonized version of Shor. When pitted against the likes of Morrowind and Somerset, or even Skyrim and Hammerfell for that matter, High Rock and the Bretons are rather ordinary. They're familiar and lack the alien customs and architecture, but they're by no means mundane. In fact, the Breton rise to prominence without the ongoing guidance of the Durrani dynasty was impressive. Some power vacuums, like the one that emerged in Cyrodiil after the conclusion of the Second Empire, can be very destructive. As lords war for the supreme position of emperor, a great deal of unrest is stirred up in their wake. But as the saying goes, find a new hill, become a king. And in High Rock, monarchs sprung up left, right and centre, but no one ruler attempted to take complete control of the province. Instead, the many individual kingdoms each sought to make their dominion flourish. 2 success stories include Rest and Daggerfall. Rest was once a sleepy fishing village, but now it is one of the most glorious cities of Western Tamriel, sparkling in her contemporary beauty, lustrous by her past, and as such, it has adopted the nickname Jewel of the Bay, with gabled roofs, grand boulevards, aromatic marketplaces. One feels that they are in a modern city when visiting Rest, but there is a magic in the air that could only come from 32 centuries of civilization. The city owed much of its prosperity to the fall of Orsinium in First Era 980, which allowed Rest to become the major trade hub of central High Rock. The Bretons often used commerce and positive relations between merchants and the crown to facilitate the rapid growth of the major kingdoms. As for Daggerfall, early Nordic census records had this to say about the port town in the west. North of the highest bluffs, south of the moors, west of the hills, and east of the sea is called Daggerfall. 110 men, 93 women, 13 children under 8 years of age, 58 cows, 7 bulls, 63 chickens, 11 cocks, 38 hogs live here. It's hard to imagine that such a settlement could become one of the most bustling metropolises in the whole of Tamriel, but here we are. As of 3rd Era 401, the population stood at over 110,000, and that doesn't even account for the cows, bulls, chickens, cocks and hogs. As an agrarian feudal society, High Rock is prone to the weaknesses that all feudal societies tend to have. Beneath the glamour of nobility and the seemingly incoherent jumble of ruling families, the vast majority of people are not lords of any holdings, and for them, life is not easy. Most Bretons fit into the middle class as merchants and artists, or the lower class peasantry, or worse, destitute beggary. Somehow though, Breton culture remedies many of the problems associated with the disproportionate division of wealth. And that brings us to the Bretons' so-called quest obsession. The Pocket Guide says, youths of all professions and trades in High Rock spend their free time in nightly pursuits, real and imagined, performing good deeds and the like for all and sundry, in oft vain efforts to achieve one day a noble status. This quest obsession, more than anything, has served as High Rock's sense of national identity, a peculiar form of altruism and mutual reliance that binds its people together. The ability to become a knight, to step into the shoes of the archetypical farm boy turned famed hero, is usually enough to quell revolts and grant even the poorest peasant the chance to dream and hope that they may be the chosen individual who could bring their family out of obscurity. And while wealth disparity absolutely exists, High Rock isn't exactly a dystopia strewn with vagrants and starving families. Most city dwellers spend their time with intellectual pursuits. Bretons seem to have an affinity for logic and ordered complexity. Their success in commerce is largely due to the fact that so many Bretons seek knowledge in all areas of life, chasing a wide variety of careers from trading to the military, sailing, medicine, textiles, manufacturing, writing, theology, philosophy, banking, and all kinds of artistry. If it exists as a scholarly pursuit, you'll find a Breton devoting a great deal of time and effort to it. Intelligence is utilised by the Bretons just as often as military might. They use espionage when possible, planting double agents in foreign governments, sending assassins to rid them of political opposition, and it can be said with some certainty that spies are as pivotal to their success in conflict as any hardened soldier. We talked earlier about the uniformity of High Rock, despite historically comprising of many different kingdoms. But in the eastern reaches, there are Bretons, or at least descendants of Breton ancestry, who are nothing like their feudal knightly neighbours. These are the Reachmen or Witchmen. They don't live in castles or strongholds, and pay no taxes to their liege lords. Neither the Bretons nor the Reachmen claim to have any association with the other, but they still warrant a mention in this video on the Bretons. They are primitive and pagan, worshipping Hircine predominantly, but also other Daedric princes like Malakath, Mehrunes Dagon, Molag Bal and Namira. A great deal of their shamanistic rituals and customs come from the Hag Ravens, who the Witchmen revere as matrons. Reachmen are a blight on the Bretons of Eastern High Rock, as too are the Orcs, especially the Orcs. Bretons and Orcs have warred for centuries, ever since the Orsimer decided to carve out a home for themselves on the mainland of Tamriel. High Rock's history since falling into the hands of the Bretons has been studded with wars and territorial disputes, and if being cantankerous wasn't a naturally occurring trait of the Bretons, then they would have surely developed it through experience. When the Yakudans arrived in Hammerfell around First Era 808, the Bretons battled with them for control of the Iliac Bay. Conflicts between Redguards and Bretons could have seen a bloody end to one or both of these races, but fortunately, the Orcs of Orsinium provided a timely common cause. They both rallied behind their hatred for the pillaging beasts and destroyed the First Orsinium by the year 980. In First Era 1029, High Rock joined the Cyrodiilic Empire. At this time, Empress Hestra was in charge, and the two powerful forces aligned, rather than the Empire taking High Rock via conquest. The Elysians knew how poorly that turned out the last time they tried. In First Era 2305, High Rock left the Empire, as the Elysian Order was at this time a shadow of its former glory. In the Second Era, year 582, a tribe of Reachmen led by Durkarak the Black Drake had seized the Cyrodiilic throne, and the savage Emperor saw this as an opportunity to take High Rock. The Reachmen tore across the west, but were inevitably thwarted by the forces of Wayrest outside the gates of Daggerfall, leading to the First Daggerfall Covenant, uniting the major Breton kingdoms. 2 decades later, an amended Daggerfall Covenant was signed, adding the forces of Hammerfell and Orsinium to the pact. When the Cyrodiilic Empire was finally graced by another dragonborn ruler, Tiber Septim, even High Rock's martial prowess was not enough to prevent a unified Tamriel being forged. When the Cameron usurper rose up in Valenwood around the 260s of the Third Era, it fell upon the forces of High Rock to put an end to his gruesome conquest. This was a fleeting example of the Breton kingdoms uniting against a common enemy. Some other occasions include the War of Ben Mark against the Nords, the War of Bethany against the Redguards, and when the Orcs attempted to resurrect Orsinium once again. After the mysterious miracle of peace, the many fractured kingdoms of High Rock were conglomerated into 5. Even with drastically fewer rulers to worry about, it's difficult to keep up with the ever-changing political landscape of High Rock. Breton kings and nobles are constantly brokering trade deals and marriage alliances. However, it is suggested by the 3rd iteration of the Pocket Guide to the Empire that the Bretons may finally be weary of constant conflict, and have eschewed violence recently in favour of diplomatic solutions. This is not to say that there have been no tensions over the new borders between Daggerfall and Wayrest, or between Camlorn and Northpoint and Evermore, but they are localised skirmishes, and have yet to explode into war, as they might have done in the past. But the Bretons will continue to exist relatively amicably, so long as there are heroic deeds to be done, and as long as the crowded marketplaces are stocked with masterfully smithed swords, freshly caught fish, and all manner of foreign delights and delicacies arriving at the famous ports of Daggerfall, Wayrest, Farron, Camlorn and Northpoint. So if you have a taste for gallantry, swear your sword to a Breton lord, and if you have a fancy for chivalry, wander the forests and climb the snowy peaks in search of damsels in distress or monsters to slay. And when you're worn out from all your adventures, settle in at one of the province's rustic inns for a warm meal and a cold ale. And that brings us to the end of our exploration into all there is to know about the Bretons of High Rock. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks so much for watching. My name is Drew, this is FudgeMuppet, and I'll see you next time.